Could the Denver Broncos have a joker in the deck with Greg Dulcich at the tight end position? We take a look at Sean Payton's praise after Thursday's OTAs. We talk about players who stand out and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Broncos OTAs for the second week wrap up in the Valley. We have all the recap, all the coverage on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen every single day, whether you watch on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you subscribe or follow so you never miss out on a brand new episode as soon as it's made available. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. OTAs for the second consecutive week in Dove Valley have wrapped up, and Thursday's practice was open to the media, our only open availability this week. And tell you what, the Broncos back on the field, it's just a good feeling. It's a good vibe because it just tells us that football is one step closer. And there was one player in particular who stood out, who Sean Payton also highlighted in his press conference after practice, and that was Greg Dulcich.
Cody, I hear the train just chugging along again. Remember last year it was the Greg Dulcich freight train, and I think Sean Payton is doing his best to get into the conductor's chair and really revive this hype train. I mean, my goodness, what he had to say after practice about Greg Dulcich has certainly lit my timeline ablaze, Cody. I don't know about you, but it's really been the discussion of what Payton said, talking about, there's a menu of passing plays that could be available for Greg Dulcich after all offseason where it was kind of up in the air. Remember, dating back to January, when Coach Payton was asked about Greg Dulcich, he kind of was non-committal. He kind of was like, he gave a really almost weird answer about how the evaluation was kind of hard and things like that. And he was very vague about what he thought about Dulcich. Now that we've, gotten to some on-field activities, we're out there, he's watching him play a little football. He gave maybe the most glowing scouting report that could ever be given about Greg Dulcich, which has definitely revived this Greg Dulcich hype freight train.
Well, on top of that as well, one thing that Sean Payton does, and this is one say I really admire about him as a head coach, he'll go around to every position and he'll also coach him up a little bit. And as we've known with his history of, really being able to evaluate tight ends, you going back to obviously Jeremy Shockey, Jimmy Graham, Jason Witten, to name a couple there. He took some time to work with the tight ends in Thursday's practice specifically, but you see that in individual period with Greg Dulcich and, and the guys working on, blocking against bags, running route tree, catching passes. But then when you go into the team period, and all of a sudden, Greg Dulcich is catching passes and showcasing his speed where guys aren't even near him. Even if you get in a 7-on-7 period, he's making plays, plays that ideally you see wide receivers make. And that kind of brings us to our next point here on today's episode of the show, where Sean Payton in the post-practice press conference was asked about Dulcich, talked about him a little bit, about the tools that he has, also mentioned maybe a potential role for him in this offense. And that is what they call, he said, the joker role. And it's not necessarily just designated to a tight end. He said it could be a running back. He says really a player who can be very dynamic and do a lot of different things well could be the joker. So that's why, hey, you know what? Greg Dulcich could be the joker in the deck here for Sean Payton and his offense this upcoming season.
He could, and the timing of giving him that name couldn't be more appropriate, right? As the Nuggets getting ready to start the NBA Finals as we record this episode, Cody. But having that joker, I thought it was really fascinating that he did refer to some older tight ends, but when he was talking about the joker specifically, he referred to 3 running backs. He referred to Reggie Bush, he referred to Darren Sproles, and he referred to Alvin Kamara. And those guys, of course, were big-time weapons in the passing game for Sean Payton when he was with the New Orleans Saints. We obviously saw Jimmy Graham take on a massive role for that offense once upon a time as well. But I think that wild card, if you want to call it something different, it's not just a joker. It's kind of that wild card option. It sounds to me, Cody, like if you're a fantasy football player or if you're somebody out there who's trying to peg, hey, who's going to be getting the most targets in this Broncos offense in 2023? I would venture to guess that Greg Dulcich probably going to be up there in the top 3. I know I've gone on record on this show as saying I think Adam Trautman could lead the team in snaps at tight end. I don't know. The good thing is that in the offseason, things are fluid and things can change. I'm fully in alignment now with what Sean Payton is saying about Greg Dulcich being this potential joker in the offense, just gushing over his ability, talking about his ball skills, talking about he can really run. This all
He
the
can.
different things that he said, and he absolutely can. I mean, he showed that last year too. I think just what he said after this practice about Greg Dulcich, you almost wish, man, could you give us this on for the entire 90-man roster? Like, I want to hear what you had to say about all these guys. For Dulcich, though, it's a big, big sign that he is going to play a massive role in this offense.
Well, and on top of that, the Broncos also added another tight end to the roster, Tommy Hudson, who spent some time with the Carolina Panthers last season. He's now another guy in that room. So if you do free up Dulcich in this joker type role, which really doesn't necessarily put him as a slot outside inline, I mean, he could even be in the backfield. It gives you, I think, more flexibility with your personnel. So I'm excited to see maybe from the roster construction standpoint, if Dulcich does play this joker role, does it really impact maybe the depth at the tight end position, which Sean Payton also, I thought, did a really good job going at great lengths of explaining to all of us, especially when it was talking about, he was asked a question about Elliott Fry, the kicker, coming in. He said, you really just can't look at the depth chart right now because there's competition all across the board, not only just on your team, but with 31 other teams that you always have to evaluate things. And he went into great detail about a story as well, which I think Broncos fans should keep in mind after the Elliott Fry signing here at the kicker position. He mentioned something that we had 2 kickers in training camp that we, had battling all throughout the day, and media always takes notes and they tally who won the day, who did this, who did that. He said, but those 2 guys, we ended up signing somebody else who got cut during the NFL preseason, and we didn't sign those 2 guys that we had in camp. So looking at the people and the bodies that Denver has on the roster, not just a kicker, but also a tight end, maybe gives you an idea that, hey, competition is widespread right now for this team, a brand new coaching staff. To me, it's refreshing to hear that, because you can have some guys from former regimes in the building, but can they pick up the new stuff? And I asked Sean Payton about that at practice as well. I said, what's the challenge of coming out here, with a good portion of these guys who've had 3 different coaches on the offensive side of the ball, 3 different schemes? How do you get them to forget all the old stuff and learn the new stuff? And he said, it's kind of a blend of you have to also know what they're good at, right? And if they're good at this, we need to learn that as coaches. So it's not just like, hey, it's the coach's way. It's, we know what this player does really well. How can we maximize him within our scheme based on what he does well? So to me, those are some exciting tipping points here that Sean Payton has revealed openly here to the media. It's also to everybody in Broncos country. There's a lot of exciting things that could be in the works, but ultimately the pads are not on yet. That's going to be the real evaluator. And he even talked about that as well, that guys are different. Guys who may look timid out here in OTAs, when the pads come on, maybe that's just a light switch that flips in them and you see a different person. He said the grade for them becomes a little bit higher. I'm excited. OTAs, you only get so much out of it, right? But mini camp is coming up. Training camp will be at the end of next month. There's a lot to go to talk about. There's a lot to happen between now and then in Broncos country. Sayre and myself, we'll have you covered every step of the way here. Locked On Broncos every single day, whether you watch on YouTube or listen wherever you get your podcast. But on today's episode of the show, we're going to dive deep into who are some players that stood out during Thursday's OTA practice at the Centura Training Center in Dove Valley. You're going to get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs, because right now new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. With the NBA Finals ongoing between the Denver Nuggets and the Miami Heat, they have you covered. And there's no better place to bet all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Well, which players are standing out here as we have another week of Denver Broncos OTAs? Who specifically is out there making plays, even without the pads on? The ebbs and flow of the offseason. You have guys out with opportunities to go out and stack up days. So, Cody, you were out there watching practice. I know that Sean Payton has some pretty strict rules about things that you can and can't share, although he was pretty open after practice about the fact that today was a heavy emphasis on third downs. So hit us, and the listeners with some guys that you feel really stood out here as you were able to watch Thursday's OTAs session.
Yeah, before we get into some players, to kind of to your point about third down, like he mentioned, like today was the third down day, and it's really about okay, the offense is facing third down situations, the defense is facing third down situations, so it's a balance between okay, how does the defense perform? How does the offense perform? How does the offense perform when there's pressure being set at the quarterback? How can they respond, whether it's third and short, third and medium, third and long? I mean, these are all these different simulations that are being thrown out there, so I do want to highlight that. But let's talk about some players that definitely stood out during practice overall. In terms of guys that are, big name, we talked about Greg Dulcich already. He's a shoo-in. We've already talked about him, had a couple of really nice plays. I can't go into detail exactly what he did, but he was all over the place, demonstrating speed, demonstrating his ability to locate the football, and also maybe even at times getting behind a defense. Those are the only things I can reveal about Greg Dulcich, but I also want to highlight Courtland Sutton as well, who once again, one of the players that we talked about in a recent episode here on the show for all you everydayers out there in terms of offensive players you should not write off. Courtland Sutton, I felt like also had a big day, had several contested catches on the day, utilizing his body position, his height to really kind of, I'd say, maximize his opportunities within his catch radius, whether that was, a vertical play or whether that was just, hey, using his size to, box out maybe a smaller defender in terms of coverage. Courtland was a guy who was consistent, caught some good passes today, didn't have any drops from what I witnessed and acknowledged at practice as well. He's a guy that stood out. But let's also talk about, another guy as well, and that's Brandon Johnson. Now, look, I want to go through and talk about maybe what he was able to do a little bit. We saw some pieces last year in the NFL preseason that, hey, Brandon Johnson is a guy that maybe, could step up, maybe play a role as an undrafted guy. He eventually did, but unfortunately that was due to the Broncos dealing with injuries last season. He had a very impressive day, kind of filling in for, maybe where Tim Patrick would be. Tim Patrick was there, was dressed out, but obviously they're still taking their time in terms of being patient, not rushing the process. Brandon Johnson had a couple of big plays from my recollection as well during practice. I can't exactly tell you what he did because I'm not allowed to, but he did make some good plays, which, hey, it doesn't matter what Sean Payton said in terms of doesn't matter how you got here, that you're here, you're making the opportunities happen, you're making the most of them. And that's exactly what Brandon Johnson did.
And he's an underrated guy. He's a guy that I think is, I mean, we could have included a lot of players on the episode that we talked about, guys who are kind of being written off. But I think you look at just the receivers that have been added this offseason, and it's kind of easy to write off guys like Brandon Johnson or Jalen Virgil or, players like that who are kind of on the back end of this receiver group who it's like, can they really beat out a Marquez Callaway for a roster spot or something like that? And so I think it's great for Brandon Johnson to continually stack up days. We know he's already got chemistry with Russell Wilson, right? I mean, dating back to last year, he was out working out at San Diego with Russ and the boys, doing those types of things as an undrafted rookie. So now for him, he's got that year under his belt. He's got an opportunity to really go out there and like we're going to talk about with Ben Powers, really seizing those opportunities and really taking advantage. But we'll get to that in a little bit. But who else, Cody, as you talk about some guys on the offensive side that stood out, what about on the defensive side? Because we know those DBs are out there trying to make some plays against these receivers.
Yeah, and look, and Sean Payton even alluded to this after practice. He said during OTAs, because obviously the offensive line, defensive line, you can't have contact. There's not a lot of physical contact that's allowed. So a lot of the evaluation, look, you can see how you align as a DB against a receiver. You can make plays on the football. You can, you have every right to the football that the receiver does. And so during the team periods, a couple DBs flying around making plays. And I would have to say, Jaquan McMillan, who we saw start last year in the final regular season game against the Los Angeles Chargers, went up against Mike Williams and did a pretty damn good job, got robbed of an INT. He's another player that continues to make plays, whether that's getting a hand on a football with an interception or even just knocking passes down or just being there in tightly contested coverage to where it's hard for the wide receiver to even make a play. He's also made a couple of plays here at practice. I want to highlight him, but also Delonte Hood coming up, making a couple of plays as well for the Broncos in terms of the secondary. But Sayre, I really want to highlight the Broncos linebacker group here. It doesn't matter if it's the guys we perceive as the projected starters, the guys who are rotating in, and a guy we also just talked about as well as a defensive player you can't write off, and Jonas Griffith. I felt like the linebacker unit during Thursday's practice, they got a lot of work. They got a lot of reps because, hey, you know what? It was a third down day. and you can't have contact. So you know what? It's working on your pass drops. It's working on identifying maybe where you need to get to on the field in a certain coverage, whatever it may be. But these guys were making plays. Some guys deflecting passes at the line of scrimmage. Some guys deflecting passes when they're dropping back into coverage, which lead to other opportunities on the back end of the secondary. The linebacker unit looked really well for the Broncos in Thursday's practice in the Valley.
That's great to hear. Obviously, you want to see those guys out there flying around, playing instinctively. I'd be interested to know too the pass rush situation, Cody. It sounded like there was a report that Baron Browning wasn't out there. What are you seeing from maybe Jonathan Cooper? I mean, I assume he would be the top guy off the edge at this point in time, opposite of Randy Gregory. Did you notice anything from the pass rush unit? I know we didn't include this in the script, but it just kind of, as you talking about the linebackers, kind of made me think about those pass rushers out there. What are you seeing from these guys, especially as we're talking about third down work?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Jonathan Cooper has been a very stable part of the two viewing periods that we've been able to have as local media for this week and last week. Cooper looks good with the number 0. I'll tell you that. Very disciplined off the edge, as we've talked about, we've highlighted here on the show. But obviously, I did not see Randy Gregory during this week's practice. And obviously, I want to mention here for anybody that's listening, because when they hear that a player's not there, they automatically jump to conclusions in a sense. Anytime a player is not at OTAs, look, this is all voluntary, right? But even if a player is gone, the coaching staff knows why. They're in communication with the player. So it's already accounted for by the coaching staff. It's not like this guy's a surprise. Oh my gosh, nobody knows where he is. The coaches know exactly. The players have a good reason for not being there if they're not there, as disclosed by Sean Payton after practice. But you know what? It's another opportunity for us to see a little bit more of Nick Bonito, who, Sayre, you and I have talked about as well. For his stature as being a second round pick, a late second round pick, just a season ago, you want to see him take the next step, right? So now you get opportunities here. And what can you do? I'd say maybe one of the bigger critiques that he had coming out of college is, can he be consistent as a guy who maintains edge discipline, right? Edge contain, especially against the run or against maybe athletic quarterbacks to get outside. Can he keep contained? That's one area I looked at with Bonito during Thursday's practice. Stood out really well. I mean, very disciplined there. Nobody got to the outside of him, which, from my observation and my experience as a coach, it's always a great thing. And for anybody that watches football, as well, anytime someone gets the outside of an edge rusher, everyone's like, hey, what happened there? That didn't happen with Nick Bonito. And I think it's good reps, good valuable experience. And here's the thing with how the Broncos are doing things in practice. They'll have various team periods, right? But there's different guys on different fields. And so they're maximizing high reps. They want to get volume with these guys, and every rep and every player on the field is filmed. So that is good for the position coaches to go back and to evaluate. But yeah, I mean, Jonathan Cooper, Nick Bonito, they also look pretty well during Thursday's practice as well.
And you can't help but wonder, with that context in mind, I mean, are the Broncos maybe going a youth movement off the edge a little bit? I think that's fair to wonder, given the guys they currently have there. Unless, I guess, Cody, we'll see. As of the time we're recording this, it is June 1. We'll see about any post June 1 moves that the team potentially makes as they get a little additional cap space on Friday from the Brandon McManus release, obviously adding $3.75 million to that salary cap number for the Denver Broncos. So potentially, as Sean Payton alluded to one of the last times we heard from him, maybe some more moves on the horizon, potentially maybe some help off the edge. I guess we'll kind of have to wait and find out. But it's great to hear that some of these young players, I think that's the main takeaway that I have from what you said, Cody. A number of young players who really need to prove themselves coming out at OTAs and making plays, making a name for themselves. Maybe they start to stack up days. And I think that's exciting for Denver Broncos fans, because you want to have those starting groups. They need to be great. But at the same time, you're only as good as your depth a lot of times in the NFL. You're only as good as the guy you can call upon if he's got to come play in the fourth quarter of a game against the Kansas City Chiefs. So these guys that you're talking about, the Delonte Hoods, the Jaquan McMillans, Nick Bonitos, these guys need to step up and progress for this Denver Broncos roster to be really good in 2023.
And there's so much that I wish I could share with you and with Broncos Country about, like, some of the things like personnel stuff. We're not allowed to share that. But I would just say, if you're a Broncos fan, the Broncos have a lot of flexibility right now. We'll see how it changes in training camp when the roster cuts eventually happen after the preseason. But from a personnel standpoint, they have flexibility to do a lot of really exciting things. That's all I can share here. But Broncos Country, we were introduced to Ben Powers as well on Thursday for the first time ever. We got to hear why he chose the Denver Broncos and his mentality. We'll talk about that much more in today's episode, Locked On Broncos, Real quick, make sure you run over to the Locked On Nuggets podcast. Make sure you subscribe or follow them so you don't miss out on any action of NBA Finals coverage, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Adam Mares and Matt Moore do a great job with the Locked On Nuggets podcast. You can get that wherever you get your podcast, or you can watch on YouTube. One of the Broncos' key offseason acquisitions on the offensive line was Ben Powers, coming over from the Baltimore Ravens. He shared an interesting insight into the type of person he is on the field, off the field, why he chose Denver, and some other things as well. As we got to know Ben Powers on Thursday. Just want to say thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. You can get this podcast on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate you so much for rocking with us every single day for all your Broncos news, content coverage, and more. Sayre, we were introduced to Ben Powers, and I'll tell you this, my first impression on, outside of just seeing him in a helmet and a jersey, when he walked into the media workroom here for his press conference, I was like, man, this guy's big. And you can definitely tell this is the path that Sean Payton wanted to go this offseason, getting bigger on the offensive line, because bigger and combined with a little bit of athleticism means more power running, which means more sustainability in hopes of turning the offense around.
I see what you did there, Cody. More power running. I like it. I like that. You know, Ben Powers, he really strikes me as a man of few words, but you know what? I think it was great to get to hear from him. He's a big money free agent acquisition. So of course he's going to get the chance to meet the media and have a chance to, you know, kind of maybe bust some people's chops a little bit. I loved what he was up there talking, Cody. Just very straightforward, very honest, very upfront. Like I said, a man of few words. And although he's a man of few words, I think you're right, Cody. He is humongous. I saw a picture of him next to Garrett Bowles, next to Mike McGlinchey, walking off the practice field. And my goodness, Ben Powers, I mean this in the best possible way, he gives Quinn Miner's belly a run for its money. So everybody, you got to go on Twitter and look for these pictures of these guys, because the Broncos have a massive offensive line. When Garrett Bowles is kind of the smallest guy out there, I mean, you know that you've got some hogs up front. So I love seeing that from Ben Powers, but I also loved hearing, you know, he was asked why he came to Denver in the first place. You hear a lot of common themes from these players that chose Denver. Sean Payton is a very common theme, right? And I think Ben Powers highlighted that by saying, look, Sean Payton, he really values guards in his offense. And somebody was like, is that abnormal? And he was like, yeah, it actually is. And that's all he really said. But I thought that, I mean, man, okay, so all right, you value the guards in this offense. Ben Powers knew that going into free agency, and I think that played a huge role, obviously, in his coming to Denver.
And I even asked him that as well. And he said, you know, for me, I have so much respect for this coaching staff that is here in Denver, which is a big reason why I wanted to come here. I also asked him another question about, he's been part of an offense that is focused on really establishing a successful ground game. And he said, the one thing you have to have for that is grit. And when you look at these guys, I mean, this is a guy, as you mentioned, I remember didn't he do an interview a few years ago coming out? Wasn't it? I don't know if he was at the Senior Bowl or not, but he did some sort of interview where he said he just wants to impose his will and make grown men cry. Like, I remember that interview that he did specifically coming out of Oklahoma. But another thing as well, he calls himself an under the radar type of player. You know, someone who, you know, in high school was overlooked a little bit, had to work his way to become somebody. You know, as a rookie in the NFL, you know, was overlooked by so many teams, also had to work hard to become somebody, and now is one of the highest paid interior offensive guards in football. He had a very, very interesting response. And this also, I think, kind of goes to his personality as well. He was asked a question about maybe why, like how he felt, or maybe why he didn't return to the Baltimore Ravens. And he said, because they couldn't afford me. So, I mean, I love that confidence there from Powers. And this is a guy who just wants to bury dudes into the ground. To me, he sounded like what you want your ideal lineman to sound like at the podium. Just, hey, I'm here to work. I'm here to bury people, and I want to go home. Like he even mentioned, he's a homebody. He's not a guy that likes to get out much. He likes to just be at home, relax, and then come to work and do his thing. So I have a lot of respect for it.
That's a man after my own heart right there, Cody. I'm with Ben Powers as far as being a homebody, and really, I think that's exactly kind of the vibe that he gives off, right? He comes to work and he does his thing. He talked about, I don't post stuff on social media. He's like, I just come and do my job, and that's it. And you see the fruits of his labor. Obviously, he's a big money free agent in the NFL, and he kind of flexed that a little bit, right? I mean, he's not going on social media talking about it, but he was like, you know, I don't think the Ravens could afford me. And he was, his face was as straight as could possibly be when he said that as well. I mean, he wasn't like joking around. He may have been joking, but he didn't give off that impression. So I thought, I mean, man, I love this guy's confidence. I love the way that he plays. Obviously, we know he didn't give up any sacks last year with the Baltimore Ravens, and that's humongous. For the Denver Broncos, interior pressure has been a massive problem. Now you got a guy who's coming in from a Baltimore Ravens program where, man, they run the ball a ton, but also he didn't give up any sacks last year and barely any pressures on top of that. So he's a huge addition. He talked about playing next to Garrett Bowles. He's excited for that. He said he feels like Russell Wilson's a great leader, excited to be playing with him. Kind of got to run through the full gambit of the offseason question gauntlet, and he just kind of went one after the other with a couple of words here and there. So great to hear from him. Great to see him, because I think, man, that offensive line, just looking at those guys, I think you can feel more confident going into 2023.
He's a man of few words, and hopefully, those few words that happen involve celebration at some point during the season for the Broncos, because they've got to be better. And I will say just another notable, this isn't, this is me being Captain Obvious. It's just the Broncos offensive line looks bigger than it did last year, which part of me goes back and I wonder if Denver had the size, and in particular, these guys that they had at the offensive line, what might it have looked like, despite the fact that Butch Berry really was not great at coaching. A lot of high praise coming out of these offensive linemen as well for Zach Strief and the assistant line coach that they have currently on this team. But Broncos Country, we got to know Ben Powers on Thursday. What were your overall impressions from him as he was introduced to the media and to Broncos Country as well? If you're watching on YouTube, drop it in the comments down below. If you're listening, wherever you get your podcast, you can always tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Lockdown Broncos. For those of you watching on YouTube, you can tell I got sunburnt today. I was out in the sun. But here's the thing about Dove Valley. This is the weird thing about altitude. It was cloudy, cloud cover. My arms are burnt. They're sunburnt. My neck is burnt, and it was cloudy. So I got burnt through the clouds. So that's just a preview of what's to come. So I'm going to have to wear a hat, and I have to wear like maybe a turtleneck and long sleeves going forward here. But one thing is for certain, Broncos Country, you can expect a brand new episode every single day, all year long here, the Locked On Broncos podcast. We appreciate you so much for rocking with us. Sayre and I will have more coverage, more recap of OTAs, players to watch, and a look at maybe some second-year players who have high expectations going on to them this upcoming season. You'll get that on Monday's brand new episode of the show.